in this camp, so I'm going to go slowly. So please walk with me. Okay. Wow, so I just got it's raining in Hobart with white snow. It's raining over the Bass Strait, over that big body of water I've traveled so many times. Okay, yes, I'm really keeping it pretty slow tonight. I had so much to say, so much I was burning to actually say in this talk, and now I've arrived and I feel a little bit more like rain. So the Dharma. So I wanted to go back to something really simple. So the translation of the Dharma, as I first heard it, was teachings which support the flourishing of life. Teachings which support the flourishing of life. And I first heard this from a woman in India. And the Dharma traditionally and still is very much oral lineage, or oral an oral transmission of listening to stories, of really lending our ear. It says lending my ear, and it was the first time I'd heard a woman who wasn't a nun speak of the Dharma. You know, she had long flowing hair, incredibly sensual. I was like, wow, cool. You know, we can do it like this, can be done like this. So she translated that, the Dharma, teachings which support the flourishing of life. Or there's sometimes just the Dharma, and some of you I'm sure will know this, are the teachings of the Buddha. Well, sometimes Dharma is almost could be translated as the kind of law, the law of reality, of seeing life in its potent, profound interconnectivity as it is, you know, cutting through the dross and really seeing life as it is. Dharma, sort of truth, we could say. And yeah. And so these teachings, as I mentioned, they offer guideposts as we all walk through the wild path of our own life. As we all walk through this path, and it's said that the metaphor sometimes in the teachings is that this path is found through a very old forest, yeah, and we have to walk it. And that there are many old ones that have gone before us and have kind of bush-bashed that path. I don't know if any of you went bush-bashing. It's a pretty horrible term, actually. Someone once told me off for using it, you know, but I remember bush-bashing with real love as a kid. You know, you just get into the bush, you didn't have a track. I did it through the sand dunes, and you'd find your way through. Actually, older boys would lift me onto their shoulders, and sometimes, because I was a gymnast, and throw me in to make the path. But anyway, it said the old people have walked this path towards freedom and the maturation of the heart, have walked this path to really let the rain fall in and find a quality of love in the heart. You know, they've gone before us, and they've seen the pitfalls, and they've seen the prickles. You know, they've seen where we can go off course, and they've, you know, steered back in. So we walk this path, but we walk it accompanied by history, by men and women who have gone before us, who really want to know, what is a free mind? What is it to have a free mind while I am alive on this earth? Potent question. And so, yeah, we each walk this path with our own very particular stories, the particular ways that we have been hurt by life, that still echoes through us in the here and now, or the just particular conditions that we've grown up in, that what the inner life throws up in us, each of us very distinctly and personally, the beautiful creativity of it and the sometimes struggle of it that we have to reckon with. And all this is part of the compost for our path through the wild forest. And this being able to bring genuine care and clear seeing into our experience, to touch the sort of, we could say, light of our own awareness, something in us which can see freshly and clearly and innocently that which moves through us. That meeting what each of us sits with is very transformative, is how we concoct a really good home brew of regenerative practice. And, a beautiful man that I've always has been one of my heroes is James Baldwin. I just think he's one of the most elegant writers on race. And he would say, in each of us, he'd say, I am what time, circumstance, history has made of me, certainly. So I am certainly of what time, circumstance, and history has made of me, but I'm also much more than that. And so are we all. So again, so are we all. We're much more than just the conditions of our life somehow. And that deeper reference point is something that the Buddha was wanting us to understand, to rest back into, to see from. And it takes some time to start to see through what does darken each of our inner environments, to wield the sort of wisdom sword, to kind of cut through the strange views that we have internally that can darken the inner life, to bring out our sword, to have this love, but also a kind of sword that we could say that can, cut through really what's not true. To find that inner internal meter of what's worth listening to and what's not worth listening to. And so the path that the Buddha put forward in a very simple way has three components. And I've been speaking about this a lot. And it's got this, it has this very ethical component. And I'm going to talk more about this today. And then it has these deep practices around meditation, really skillful, tracked out methods in how we can settle the mind and how we can relate with experience in a way that's liberating. How we can really begin in time to trust the impermanent nature of our experience and not be so monopolized by the different states that move through us. How we can start to see that we are very much in flux, our experience. And how can we start to turn towards rather than away from what arises in us to see its nature. And so, and the capacity in meditation, you've got to really settle the mind so then we can start to see clearly and come into insight into vipassana, which is being able to sort of see behind the reactive mind, to see with a fresher gaze. And so when we think about ethics, and this is sometimes a component that's not always brought through, I think, with the mindfulness movement. But if we think about ethics, I think ethics, again, put really simply, is a very potent acknowledgement of our relationality. It's a potent acknowledgement that I'm not here just practicing on my own, and that what I do and what I think and what I say, maybe even how I walk, has an impact. Right? That we are informed by each other, that we influence each other, that even if we're trying not to, we cannot help but partake in this very deep network of life. Yeah. And so this ethic, this question that I mentioned in that practice, how do I relate with myself and others and the life, the sentient life around me in a way that doesn't cause more harm? That question. And not only not cause more harm, but how am I even be able to relate? What's the quality of gaze that actually allows life to flourish? And this isn't always easy, to relate with ourselves in a way that doesn't perpetuate more harm, when the heat's on and the way we will react to that heat and spin down really known pathways, the sort of fuel that can be in some of those patterns, the Buddha actually said, it's like a man being carried by other men and thrown in a fire. And sometimes where you can find where your mind goes like, how did I get here? Yeah? When the mind gets really wound up and then the body starts to be part of that wound upness, the body gets triggered, stress enters the being, and then we're in a certain state. So it's all happened. So how do we start to see and put the brakes on some of these movements and come back to the breath and come back to the body, come back to sensation? I think it's really interesting. If we think about ethics, I don't think it's not something that we impose from above, like more rules to put ourselves in a cage, but ethics that come out of in time, and I would say almost an unnumbing of our own being and our own heart, coming out of some apathy to be able to feel deeper for ourselves what feels good and what actually doesn't feel good, put really simply, what feels internally the right way to go, which our body will inform us, or what's not the way to go. We have to sort of feel that, and to start to also feel the subjectivity of the others around us. So ethics kind of comes out of a feeling rather than from top down. We know top down where there's ethic that you need to be good, and then there's all this shadow underneath, and so much of us can be in conflict. And I think ethic is something else. And ethic sometimes, it was described as to be in coordination, to be in harmony with life in a way that brings life to fruition. So these ethics. And when we start to think about in the internal world and caring for the internal world and the internal ethic around what's trustworthy internally and what's not trustworthy to listen to, what views are trustworthy and what's not trustworthy, what we can also find as we start practicing more, that it's not like we're some isolated unit inside, that the views of the culture and the prejudices of the culture also live inside of us. So as we start to feel internally, this is trustworthy or this is not trustworthy, we're engaging in a work that I think goes beyond ourself. If we think about sort of epidemics of self-harassment internally, or we think about ideas of what success is or what success should look like that the culture might impose and then we put on ourselves, it's really interesting to start to really feel what's true for us and what's not. There's so many strange views in our culture around aging or preferencing youth that can also, or body shapes, or what beauty is, or that is really, if you really look at it, it's really quite strange and can cause a lot of suffering. So how can we start to see through some of these views? And as we start to, we can see that certain patterns or ways of thinking inside that can stifle us or rob us of a certain vitality when there is strong patterns of the mind, and just to start to see this. It's said that when we're under a view or a state of mind, that we can lose connection to our own goodness or the capacity to feel the goodness of another. And so, yeah. I also think it's interesting is that when in some other cultures, and I read this by Margaret Mead, she went into a culture and it was in the Polynesian islands somewhere. And when one person in that culture was sick, they wouldn't just speak to that one person, but they would look at the whole community around what was going on. That one person's malaise wasn't an isolated component to everything else that was happening. And I find that really interesting, that the suffering, again, that each of us have usually isn't just our own. In the sense of what moved through us is also got a lineage to it. There can be generational history in the way of what certain things move through our own body. And as we care for what's happening in us in the here and now, we're also caring for the past. And yeah, there was a period, a time when I was working with actors with disabilities and creating a theatre company, and we were putting work on in mainstream theatres and working a lot with some of the views in the culture around what it was to have a disability that had been internalized. That somehow, I really didn't have anything interesting to say, or this feeling of being really confined by the gaze that had been put on you. And then there being actually so much more obvious richness internally to articulate and express that was way beyond any stereotype, and to get at those voices. And I remember, there was one monologue where one man, was talking about, I actually feel so tall like a mountain. He would start to say, I actually feel really tall like a mountain, even though people think I look small. I actually feel tall like a mountain. He was quite short. And then when he was articulating this on the stage, saying, I feel tall, so tall like a mountain. This is, if you can just stay with me with this story. But I was saying, I feel so tall like a mountain. And for this session, we'd invited a lot of people from residential day centres to come. And sometimes in that company, people speak, the anaesthetic of self-conscious is really lifted. And someone in the audience just said, bullshit, you're not tall like a mountain. He goes, no, I feel so tall like a mountain. This is in the middle of the performance. And then he went into this whole, this other, he stood just seriously, he was like, bullshit. And then he stood up and he kept on with his monologue, which was really about, what you see is not what you think. I am far beyond where you want to box me. I feel like this, I feel like this, I feel like this. I walk down the street and I strut my stuff. I feel the birds in the trees far away. I have a sensitivity. I feel everything in the room that's happening. This guy started to sort of just bust into this very real subjective experience that sort of blew everybody's minds, really, their stereotypes of this man. So what do we follow inside, and what do we not follow? I think is important. And something that I was sort of talking about, how sometimes we have to have the courage and to sort of leave the unknown and go into a new direction, and we have to go to some kind of edge, that's might not always be so comfortable. And how when the Buddha did this, and he left his very privileged position and he went into the forest and started practicing there with that deep question, what is a life that isn't just about status or appearance, that is a really fulfilling life, and what is it to have a dignity that is not just dependent on, yes, status or how well we think we're doing, but just that we're here, that every human being has these seeds of wisdom and compassion and should have access to this natural dignity and openness that has nothing to do with what we achieve even. That is a grounding place, that kind of belonging. And through practicing in those forests and settling into the body and settling into the breath and starting to look clearly, not through stereotypes, not through presumptions, not through the views of the day that kept everybody in place and that very much kept certain people in place. Is that this clear seeing, the directness started cutting through those falsities. It was very corrective, we could say, in reinstalling dignity in oneself and dignity in another. And how in those forest groves where he was practicing, so many people came that would never usually sit together. And I often think about that. You know, I often think there were royalty and there was lower caste people that were let in, that were usually kept out of the places of deep spiritual inquiry. And then, yeah, women were let in. Everybody was welcome to practice there. People that wouldn't usually sit together would be sitting side by side. So this is a very fertile edge of corrective realization into our human situation that was really bringing people closer and was a real leveling ground. And that wasn't like an intention to be a social activist or to be radical. That was just through really understanding a depth that we can rest into deeper than what conditions us, and then being able to invite other people into that was naturally corrective. That of course everybody is welcome. And so I think they're like the Buddha, how he went to those edges. I think of some of the lineage and the teachers of this insight tradition that at some point really left the known. You know, a lot of this movement happened we know about the American people, a lot of people who left their universities, who kind of dropped out of the known and just suddenly went to India, you know, crossed over those oceans and started practicing in India, in Thailand and Burma, went to, I would call these fertile edges again, to see what it is to live a really nourishing life. And found something, and then came back to these cultures and have deeply contributed some deep insight into human well-being and development, into modern sort of Western culture. We all know, you know, Jack Cornfield and Sharon Salzberg, many of you, Tara Brach, you've heard of those names, yeah. And then here in Australia, this lineage here that this Melbourne Insights part of, that many of you know, came through. I sort of been talking about this lately. Interestingly, an Englishman, who is Christopher Titmuss, that I know some of you know quite well, and then a whole lot of people began gathering around him here in Australia. And some of those people are, you know, the senior teachers in this tradition, like Patrick Kearney and Carol Perry, really wonderful human beings who also went to many edges. You know, I mean, Patrick could have gone to, you know, imagine law school, but then went to study the Dharma, and Carol, with her deep social activism and mind, studying there with Christopher, and Christopher, I think, is someone bringing those teachings from India to Australia. He stayed very true to that ethic, lived a whole life on dana, kept a real political fire burning, really, again, to cut through this suffering into living a freer life. And I went to these edges. I went to India when I was in my early 20s, and I had a very strong sort of sniff that there was something a little bit suspicious about what's happening in the normative, in the the mainstream realm of how we were relating with certain things. And I took off to India. And I feel a lot of regard for these people that I met there as a young person. I was practicing in Bodh Gaya. Some of you will know. Who's been to Bodh Gaya? Has anyone? You've been, yeah, you guys have been to. Mossy, have you been to Bodh Gaya? No. So Bodh Gaya, I remember I would be doing all of these retreats as a pretty young person. And I remember the conversations that were happening around the kitchen table, and I started to manage on these retreats. And the deep inquiry into what is a meaningful, rich, flourishing life, and all the conversations even around integral theory. I even remember conversations around trauma resolution. All that was cooking on those edges there was incredibly potent. And just sort of seeing how that is coming back down now and in, I find it so fascinating. And Anton Eastick, he was managing all the retreats there, the teacher that you'll know here. For many years, he was in Bodh Gaya, always so friendly, giving a hand to anyone. Beautiful teacher in this tradition. Years and years he's been practicing now. And people there and practicing, really giving up a whole life in the West for a while to just really engage into this body of learning. And it was a wonderful thing to be part of. But I do remember at that time meditating, and I don't know if any of you have had this experience. Now meditation is something very cool. It's something very acceptable. To say you meditate now, it's been scientifically proven, it's been validated, it's got the thumbs up from, say, the mainstream now. But for a long time, meditation wasn't cool. I didn't tell anyone that I meditated for quite a while. Meditation was something that you were a bit of a weirdo if you meditated. And so it's again this thing about that fidelity to that part of us that will go to an edge because it feels right before we get any validation from an external source. But because there's something in the heart that feels that something in this situation is a bit off and needs some correctiveness, and there needs more love here, there needs more wisdom here. We are listening to sometimes the really wrong voices of authority. What is the real or voices of authority that do speak about inclusivity and wisdom and the movement of love? And how, even in our own internal life, when the heat's on, how do we keep on coming back with that curiosity and that openness and responding to our own life with a bit more unpredictability, to stay steady with ourselves, to stay and to see. And so, I don't have much time. I think we've almost finished. I have had so much more to say. I think I'm going to have to I'll do a part 2 of this talk, because I really also wanted to talk about how these teachings in my experience have landed on country, and to talk a little bit more about Indigenous Australia and what's happening here in Victoria with the treaty. And there's a lot that I wanted to talk about from a Dharmic perspective. I think it's better to do that when I'm not so tired, actually. But what I wanted to say now really is that deep internal reference point to find what is really true, what's my North Star, that is a movement of love and creativity, and to this trusting in that, and sometimes to be able to challenge the systems or the structures that we're in, and to live a life that feels really congruent. And that sometimes we have to be a weirdo for a while, and to trust that before we get the validation. And so I just want to I think the fidelity to people who had the acknowledgement of people who knew there was something wrong in terms of the environmental crisis decades and decades ago, and sat with that truth alone. Yeah. or you sit with the truth. There's something toxic in this work environment, but everybody's complicit in it. But no, we can do better, and we can bring in more humanity here. To sit with these truths, or, I need to not do this. I need to do my art. I need to. All those moments when we are feeling a truth and it's not validated, I think is we grow our uniqueness there, and we grow our sovereignty there. And that's a really beautiful thing. So, summary, the power of ethics is an internal meter, that there's the inner ethic around how do I relate with my own life that doesn't perpetuate more pain, which comes from the awakening of the heart, where we want to be in friendship with our own life. This is a radical thing. There's so much inner conflict. And we've all been under duress in this lockdown too, but how do we keep coming back with this kindness? And then how that starts to open up in how we look upon each other. Okay, so I think I've come to the end of that talk.